Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Things Are Getting Weirder, 12 Truly Odd UFO Encounters. I'm really excited about today's episode because I'm going to cover all different types of UFO encounters. Close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, and really more than that. So we have sightings, we have landings, we have humanoids, missing time, even one apparent UFO crash. These are cases which reach from 1946 up to 1996, so that's 50 years of encounters. And of course, these are cases that have something to offer to our understanding of what UFOs can do, who these occupants are, where they come from, and have some really unique and strange elements to them that you probably haven't heard before. I mean, some are truly odd, very weird. Again, cases from all over the world, including Finland, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and 8 from the United States, including Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and finally, Texas. I think you'll find this one particularly interesting because some of these cases are just off the charts strange. So let's just get started with the first one, which I call the end of the world. This is a very early case which occurred on April 14, 1946 in Havana, Illinois. And yeah, I gave it that title because this is what the witnesses thought was happening. This is at a time, of course, when UFOs were unheard of. So this was an incredibly shocking experience for these two witnesses and just a really unusual case. This first-hand account comes from the witnesses, Paul Cummings Jr. of Quincy, Illinois, and his friend. Now, due to the strangeness and fantastic nature of his experience, he actually waited 20 years to report it. It was 5 a.m. on April 14, 1946, as he and his friend, Douglas Gowd, were driving from Canton, Illinois to Lincoln. And they were about 10 miles east of Havana, Illinois, near the intersection of Highway 10. You can see it here. It was still dark at the time, and theirs was the only car on the highway when, without warning, about 1 mile ahead of them on this perfectly straight highway, they both saw a massive, bright, glowing sphere. It was right above the road, and almost immediately it began to zoom towards them. As Paul says, the object seemed to glide straight down the highway towards us about 1 foot above the pavement and occupied the entire roadbed, possibly touching both shoulders of the highway. So that's pretty big. This highway was about 20 feet wide, and the object appeared to be on a direct collision course with their vehicle. And in moments, this thing, whatever it was only 200 feet from their car. So fearing a head-on collision, Paul swerved the car off the highway, jammed on the brakes, they opened the doors, and both men jumped out of the car as fast as they could and threw themselves into the ditch alongside the highway. They lay face down and covered their heads with their arms to protect themselves from what they were sure was going to be a collision. In fact, Douglas shouted out, "It's the end of the world." Now this object moved directly overhead, at which point they heard no noise, they felt no heat. They were face down, so they didn't actually see it at this point, and they remained lying on the ground for about 2 minutes before finally gathering the courage to get back up. They looked up and down the highway all around, but the object was gone. They discussed what they had seen, briefly discussed the possibility that maybe they had seen the rising sun, but they knew that was not the case. It was still dark. They could not come up with any explanation. Looking at the car, they saw that the headlights were still on, the doors were open just as they had left it. They got back into the car and drove on to the nearby town of Mason, where they had breakfast and excitedly discussed what they had seen. But as Paul says, it was certainly a very frightening experience, and I have been very reluctant to repeat the story to others due to what I considered a fantastic episode at that time. Now, I would classify that case as a simple sighting, a close encounter of the first kind, and yet you can see that even a simple sighting, if there is such a thing, can be an incredibly traumatic experience. UFOs do seem to have this penchant for chasing cars down roads, and this is a very early example of that. I can only imagine what it must have been like for these two witnesses to actually jump out of their car and lie in a ditch, wondering what was going to happen. A really amazing case. Now I want to move to the next one, which got quite a bit of attention. This one is really, really unusual. I call this one the perfect case. That ends with a question mark, because this case does have some extremely unusual elements to it. It occurred on October 23rd, 1954, in Tripoli, Libya. This was misreported by a number of sources saying it occurred in Italy, but no, it did not. This was in Libya. But as you'll see, it has some really strange elements to it. This involves a landing with humanoids. Again, this case got a lot of attention. It was widely published, but as far as I can tell, it was first published in Clypeus magazine and in Italian newspapers, but was in Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, which really popularized this case. The witness is an Italian farmer by the name of Carmelo Papotto, who at that time lived and worked in Tripolitania, Libya. Again, not in Italy, as several sources report. It was 3 a.m. on October 23, 1954, as Carmelo was checking the fields, as he did each morning. These fields had been freshly plowed. In the darkness, he suddenly saw a small craft descend from the sky slowly to the ground, he says drifting down like snow does, and actually landed 40 to 50 feet away from him. Now his first thought was that this was a military helicopter, but it didn't sound like one, and he soon saw that it wasn't. It was oval-shaped, like an egg on its side. The lower half was metallic. On the front sides there were two ports. In the center there was a ladder on the outside of the craft. The undercarriage had two cylindrical tubes extruding downwards. The back had two single wheels, and the front half had two sets of double wheels. The back part of the craft also had a group of tubes facing backwards that looked to Carmelo much like gun barrels. So you can see the drawing of this craft here. Very odd. Now the top half was a transparent domed fuselage lit with a brilliant white light, and inside there were 6 men seated. Each of them were wearing yellow coveralls and what appeared to be gas masks, and as this craft came in for a landing, it made a sound that Carmelo described as being like a compressor, or as he says, like those used for inflating car tires. Now on top of this dome there were 2 what appeared to be antennae. The whole craft was about 18 feet long and 9 feet wide, not terribly large, but he said it had the silhouette of, quote, an aerodynamic automobile. Now after the craft landed, Carmelo saw one of the men immediately remove his gas mask, and he could now see that this man was definitely human-looking. This man began to blow into some kind of tube that was inside of the fuselage. Now Carmelo was very curious, so he approached and actually walked right up to this craft, went to the ladder and placed his hand on one of the rungs, intending to climb it. But as soon as he did this, he instantly got a strong electric shock, which actually threw him to the ground. It was at this point that one of the men inside the craft gestured at Carmelo, warning him to keep away from the craft. Another occupant inside this covered dome pulled out what looked like a wheel of some kind, then replaced it and pushed a button which caused a container to cover this wheel. Carmelo could see what looked like a radio set, complete with wires, being operated by a man who was wearing earphones. All 6 of the occupants were very busy observing and working with various instrument panels in front of them. Now Carmelo watched this for quite some time. I mean, this craft was on the ground, he estimates, for about 20 minutes, when suddenly it took off, now in perfect silence. It rose vertically to a height of 150 feet, and then, per Carmelo, darted off at dizzying speed towards the east. Afterwards, there were imprints about 2 feet long left on the soft ground. These were allegedly verified and photographed. Now again, this case took place in the middle of the very intense French wave of sightings in October, November of 1954. It involved not only sightings, but landings and humanoids. And in fact, there were several other landings reported on this very same day in France. Jacques Vallée calls this case, quote, the perfect case. And he calls it this because it illustrates his theory that UFOs are not extraterrestrial craft, but instead are, as he says, physicalized, quote, three-dimensional holograms with mass projected through time. As Jacques Vallée says, I would say this is what the farmer saw. It is tempting to assume that the farmer, far from witnessing by chance the maneuvers of interplanetary visitors, was deliberately exposed to a scene designed to be recorded by him and transmitted to us. Hence, the gas masks, the instrument panels, and the radio set complete with wires. I personally not so sure about this, because if you do some research into this time, 1954, this appears to be the time we were doing anti-gravity research. So Jacques Vallée's theory is certainly interesting, but to me it seems to be far more likely that what this witness saw was a secret military craft piloted by humans from Earth. So by any measure, that's a truly unusual case. I honestly do think this is a perfect example of reverse engineering. Yes, it did take place during this massive UFO wave over France, all kinds of landings and little humanoids being seen. But this witness described what appears to be human-looking people. I mean, they were wearing yellow jumpsuits and gas masks and had headphones and radios. It really does look like a case of reverse engineering, particularly because there were wheels on the craft. I have yet to hear of a genuine UFO that has wheels. I really don't buy into Jacques Vallée's explanation that this was an orchestrated event for the witness put forth by an alien intelligence. But you can make up your own minds about it. And again, definitely an interesting case. Now let's move to the next one. Boy, I wish I was there for this one. At least I think I do. Because this one is a very dramatic case. I call this one Panic at 8,000 feet. This occurred on November 21st, 1954 as well, over the Paraíba River in Brazil. And this is one of many cases involving UFOs seen from aircraft. But to me, the most interesting aspect of this case is how the people in the aircraft reacted. This very dramatic case is virtually unknown in the United States, but apparently was published in newspapers both in South America and the UK. It did have a brief mention in Richard Hall's book, The UFO Evidence. And this case involves a Brazilian airliner that was cruising at 8,000 feet. This was on the night of November 21st, 1954, again over Paraíba River, Brazil. This plane had a crew and 13 passengers. So there they are, flying at 8,000 feet, when, without warning, a brilliant light illuminated the plane, and looking outside, everyone on the plane saw 19, get that, 19, circular craft. They estimate these craft were about 100 feet in diameter. They were moving at very high speed in formation and were at the same elevation of the plane and very close to it, only 300 feet away. In fact, the craft appeared so quickly that the pilot had no time to react in terms of maneuvering the plane, and instantly there was complete pandemonium in the aircraft. The passengers were unified in their panic and terror at the sight of these 19 mysterious objects. In fact, one female passenger started screaming and in a complete panic rushed into the pilot's cockpit and had to be physically subdued. Another frantic male passenger, quote, lost his mind, and he actually tried to open an exit door in mid-flight. One of the crewmen had to fight with this passenger to subdue him and restrain him. Finally, these UFOs moved off. Calm was finally restored. This plane landed at Rio, where, as you can imagine, news of this incident spread quickly, reaching the United States. Researcher Donald Kehoe heard about it, and when he did, he felt that he finally understood why Brazil was expressing such concern over what they called, quote, the UFO problem. Admittedly, that is a very short case, very sparse on details. I understand that it was published in a number of places, and there's probably some more information about it out there. I couldn't find it, but I thought it was an important case because it shows how profoundly people can react in fear to even a simple sighting. I mean, let's face it, these people weren't taken on board or anything like that. They just saw UFOs outside the plane. Yeah, there were 19, so I can certainly understand how that would be quite traumatic. But a really interesting case. Now this next one. This one has missing time. This one has an almost landed UFO, humanoids. This one's really unusual. I call this one Something Was Very Wrong. This occurred May 12, 1963. That is approximate, but pretty close, in Sawyer, Michigan. There are 3 witnesses to this one, but some very unusual elements. I think it's an important case. This case was reported to MUFON, and it comes from a gentleman by the name of Rick. I believe he was a teenager at the time of this incident. It was around 9:30 p.m., May 12, 1963, and Rick was fishing alone in his little rowboat on a little man-made lake directly off of the I-94, not far from his home in Sawyer, Michigan. Now his friends, 2 younger brothers, were standing on the shore of the lake and waved to him, asking him to take them for a ride in his rowboat. Rick agreed. He rowed to the shore, picked them up, and they began to row around the lake. Now at some point, Rick noticed 2 people standing at the edge of the lake, close to the freeway side, and he immediately assumed that they were his 2 friends, who often met him there on the lake to go fishing. So he began to row over towards them, and this is when things began to get weird. I'll just let Rick describe this because he describes it in really interesting detail. As Rick says, I rode up to them, maybe 15 feet away, and started calling their names. No reply. It was dark, and I couldn't make them out, except in silhouette. I was about to row closer when the kids in the back started screaming and crying. I turned to them, and they pointed to my left, and I saw this object floating maybe 2 feet off the water, 100 feet away. The object was oval, with a flattened bottom, and maybe 10 to 20 feet wide. Its color was an opalescent white that did not reflect on the water. It didn't make a sound or disturb the surface of the water, and it seemed to be slowly coming towards us. When I realized something was very wrong, I turned the boat around and headed for the opposite shore where we kept the boat. I did not bother to look at the object again. I was scared and rowing my heart out. We were all scared to death, and ran for the kids' house as soon as we hit the shore. When we came into their house, their mother and father started yelling at the 3 of us, asking, "Where the hell were you?" So Rick told them, I took the boys for a ride, and he tried to explain what happened, but the father cut him off and said, "Bullcrap." He actually swore. He explained that they had combed the area by the lake thoroughly, actually walked around it, calling for them for the last hour, and they were not there. They found nothing. Rick, of course, protested and said, "We didn't see you or hear you." And that's when the father pointed to the clock and said that it was 11:15 p.m. Rick stared at the clock in amazement because he thought the time should have been no later than 10 p.m. It was clear to them that they were missing about 1 hour of time or more. And as Rick says, there's more to this, but it's hard to explain here. This has bothered me since that day, and I simply had to get it off my chest. I really would like to talk to the witness on that case because he hints that there's quite a bit more to it, and I think there probably is. I want to know if they had any dreams following this encounter, any physical effects, anything else that was going on at that time that was unusual, because with that kind of missing time, I mean, that's a red flag that this was more than just a sighting, even more than just humanoids, probably an onboard encounter. Hard to say for sure without talking to the witnesses, but it's an important case because there are many people who claim even now that UFO events, particularly on-board cases, are psychological. No. These parents were looking for these kids for an hour. They were not where they were supposed to be. It's one of many cases where people are missing from the location where they're supposed to be. So where were they? Presumably on board a craft. So definitely in that regard, I think it's an important case. And now we move to another case, which has got some of the most unusual elements to it I think I've ever heard. And it's got a lot of verification to it. Quite a few corroborating witnesses, landing traces, physiological effects, and more. So I think you'll find this a truly compelling case. I call this one the Shocking UFO. This occurred on June 14 in 1964 in the very small town of Dale, Indiana. And boy, I'm telling you, this is quite a case. This case comes from NICAP, the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and also from Project Blue Book. It involves Charles V. Engelbrecht, an 18-year-old factory worker. He was in his home outside of the small town of Dale, Indiana, watching television, and at 8:55 p.m. on June 14, 1964, he saw an odd-looking light pass by the kitchen window outside. So he went to investigate, and as he did so, the television set failed, and all the house lights went out, and going outside, he saw a glowing, basketball-sized or larger, orange object resting on the ground in the backyard, not too far from the back steps. He said it was sharply defined, self-luminous, and may have been as big as 3 or 4 feet in diameter. So he walked up to it. He tried to approach it, but he felt this strange static electric force field blocking his forward progress. And as he calls it, it was some strange power. This held him back. It froze him in his tracks. And as he says, I was numb. I didn't know what to do. So he called out to his parents, and at this point, this object rose up into the air, moved west over the barn, and darted away. As it moved off, he heard it making a strange whistling sound, and its color changed to bright red, then to blue-purple, then to white, and finally bright red as it darted away. He estimates that this encounter lasted for about 5 minutes, and as soon as it was gone, the lights in the television went back on in the house. Now Charles immediately noticed several very odd things. There was an extremely strong smell of sulfur where this object had landed. He described it as, quote, as if 1,000 matches were being lit at once. He also noticed a few other things. The power lawnmower that they had actually rolled 10 feet from its normal location directly towards this landing site, as if pulled by a powerful magnetic force. Also, a metal can placed on a nearby table that was used for chicken feed fell off the table, again moving in the direction of this object. There was also a metal hoe that had been leaned up against the house, and this was pulled 50 feet from its original location, again towards the object. And finally, there was a water trough for the chickens, which overturned. So there appears to be some sort of magnetic force surrounding this object that not only pulled all these metal objects towards it, but stopped Charles Engelbrecht in his tracks. And now, looking at the site where this object landed, he saw that there was a 6-foot wide area of swirled grass, and in the center of it was a small burned area about the size of a dinner plate with 3 indentations in the form of a triangle. Each of these indentations were about 1 inch in diameter and 1 inch deep. And the soil appeared to be, quote, hard caked ground, as if exposed to tremendous heat. Now, Charles' parents were in the house next door, but they did notice that the power had gone out. They also saw this strange glowing light, and going to the scene, they also smelled this powerful sulfur odor. They did say that they also had seen an unusual light 1 week earlier, but just assumed it was a shooting star. Now, Charles did report his experience to the police, and Dale Police Chief Leroy Musgrave arrived on the scene. He verified the odor. He said he could actually smell it a 1/4 mile away. He saw the burn spot. He spoke with Charles and his parents, and regarding this object, he said, I have no idea what it could have been. Now, this case really started to attract attention, and Project Blue Book officers were contacted, and they agreed to investigate. William T. Powers of Project Blue Book came to interview Charles firsthand. He verified the burn spots on the ground and the indentations in the ground. Now, he had come to this site thinking Charles must have just seen ball lightning, but seeing these indentations in the ground, he discarded this theory. This is what he told Charles and his parents. He said that it did not look like lightning nor a meteor. He did tell them that he found what appeared to be a piece of metal on this landing location that had a grooved surface and was light in weight. Now, nothing more was heard of this piece of metal other than the Engelbrechts said that William T. Powers told them that it was, quote, like a walnut and had, quote, properties of a meteorite, and that it was, quote, radioactive, as it turned out was this whole circular area. Now later, NICAP did bring Geiger counters that apparently showed no radiation, though this was some time after the encounter. Some of the reports on this case also mention an oily residue. NICAP researchers did take samples of this, but the samples that they took turned out to be of insufficient quantity for analysis. Now, when this case really started to get a lot of attention, William Powers of Project Blue Book did some serious backtracking, and he said that this UFO, get this, and I quote, may be nothing more than a burning newspaper that fluttered into the yard. Then he said that, quote, somebody played a prank on the Engelbrecht family. And then he said that it could possibly be, quote, swamp lights caused by marsh gas. And despite his earlier denial regarding ball lightning, he said that this object could have been, quote, a ball of lightning. Finally, in the file for Project Blue Book, he called it, quote, a hoax. That's Project Blue Book for you. That's what, 5 debunking explanations that themselves are contradictory of each other. Crazy. Now, this odor persisted for several days. Soon after the sighting, the cherry trees and other garden plants next to where this object had landed all died. Immediately following this incident, Charles had first-degree burns on his arms and face, very much like a sunburn. And following this incident, he had no appetite. He started to suffer from diarrhea, and he ended up losing about 18 pounds. He says he did not feel his normal self until the end of that summer. And there were other weird effects. The family said that the water from their cistern was, quote, odorous and distasteful. Also, later it was discovered that about 15 feet away from this landing site, the family found a 150 to 200 foot diameter area where the 5-foot-tall corn plants were mysteriously discolored, turning much darker green than the surrounding areas. Now, whether this was directly affected by the UFO is hard to say, but one other thing, this is a very strange animal effect. They noticed that their cows produce much more milk than normal, and they also noticed that their chickens laid many more eggs. Now, it wasn't only Charles who saw this, it turned out. There were quite a few other witnesses, because at 1:30 a.m. that night, some brothers, Paul Sellner, age 19, and his little brother John Sellner, age 16, were driving along the River Road. This is by the Ohio River, approaching Rockport. This is about 23 miles south of Dale, when they saw what they described as a glowing object on the other side of the river. They said it came directly towards them at about treetop level, approaching almost to within 600 feet and then veering off. To them it appeared quite large, 30 to 45 feet in diameter, and they said they watched it for a full 10 minutes until it went out of view. They were very frightened by it, and they left the area at high speed, and they listened to the radio, and per them, they heard on the radio that this object allegedly hit a farmhouse, causing a television to blow up. Researchers were not able to confirm this, and this could perhaps be an exaggeration of Charles Engelbrecht's sighting. Now, this was not all that went on. 4 nights later, on June 28, 4 girls in this same small town of Dale said that at 15 minutes after midnight, they were actually chased by a white ball of light for a full 5 minutes. Also, on that day, 35 miles to the southeast in Germantown, the James E. Stowe family said that they found a, quote, perfect circle. This was 5 feet in diameter in their alfalfa field, and in the center of the circle were 3 burned circles in a triangular shape, each about 3 inches in diameter. So something's going on here. There is one more witness who deserves mention. She heard about all this sighting and she decided to speak out. Her name is Iva D. McCoy. She lived in Grandview. This is located 21 miles approximately south of Dale. And she said that as a child, she and her family frequently saw strange lights that, quote, don't look like any other lights you ever saw. She said that when she was a kid, mind you, this is in the late 1880s, she would watch these balls of light come up out of the ground. She says that once she saw more than a dozen of these objects in the fields, and says that over the years she probably had seen hundreds of them. And she says that they also sometimes left circles in the field, anywhere from 3 to 6 feet wide. Once she said she and her husband were followed home in a horse-drawn carriage. She says that they have struck her house at one point and even trees, and she calls them, quote, mineral lights, and thinks that the minerals in the ground are probably drawing them or creating them somehow. She says that she noticed one other detail is that lightning will often strike the area where these objects come out of. At any rate, quite a few witnesses to the Charles Engelbrecht sighting, and hearing about all these other witnesses, Charles said, I don't feel so bad now that others have reported it. Truly amazing. And how about the antics Blue Book went through to try to explain this away as everything from ball lightning to swamp gas to a burning piece of newspaper. Honestly, that's so disingenuous. A burning piece of newspaper does not leave imprints in the ground or, has a smell that carries for a quarter mile. Come on. That's a ridiculous debunking explanation. Also, when you consider how many other witnesses there were. This was clearly part of a pretty large and active UFO wave. But what an experience that was for the witness. Amazing. Now let's move to another case. This one got quite a bit of attention from UFO researchers who found the witness to be quite credible. This one is called Something from Another World. This occurred on June 29, 1964, outside of Livonia in Georgia. It is a single witness case, though there's quite a few corroborating witnesses, and this does have physical evidence, quite a bit of it actually, and it's a really unusual case. Again, of someone who encounters a UFO on a lonely highway at night. It was 1 a.m. on the evening of June 29, 1964, that Beaufort E. Parman, a 47-year-old businessman and former military officer from Welford in South Carolina, was returning home from a business trip in Atlanta, Georgia. He was driving late at night on this lonely highway between Carnesville and Livonia, Georgia. He was moving at about 65-70 miles per hour in his Chevy Impala when he noticed a brilliant light in the sky. Now, he first thought briefly that it might be a meteor, but he immediately discarded that theory when this object zoomed down and started coming directly towards him. As Beaufort says, it came straight down towards my car. In the next moment, it was right in front of the headlights, spinning like a giant top. It was shaped like a top, and it made a hissing sound like a million snakes. The top of the object moved clockwise, the bottom counterclockwise. Clear lights seemed to be sucked in through small openings in the object. Now, Beaufort says that as this object approached, it, quote, stopped in the air like a hummingbird. Immediately, his car engine started to skip and slow down. He kept driving, but as he did so, this object hovered right in front of his car, only 1 or 2 feet above the road and 5 feet ahead of him. He could now see that it was about as wide as the top of his car. He estimates 8 feet wide, 6 feet tall, and as he says, big enough to hold a man. It was very close to him. He got a really good look at it. As he says, I saw it so clearly, I believe I could build one of the things. He could see a sort of tower-like projection on the top, small, what looked like portholes on the bottom, from which orange lights, maybe flames, were issued. He said the object was amber-colored and brightly illuminated by these yellow lights coming out of these portholes or these holes. Now, after just a few seconds, this object whooshed over the top of his car at very low level, lifted back up into the sky, Beaufort again was still driving, and this object now dropped down for a second time right in front of his car, pacing him for 1 or 2 miles, right in front of him, never touching the car, but flying right in front of it. He said it was tilted towards him, and he said he followed this UFO almost in a trance-like state. Then, without warning, it went back over the roof, this time leaving a very strong odor, which he said was like embalming fluid. It emitted a gaseous vapor which coated the front of his car with this weird oily substance. He felt a very strong heat as it passed overhead. At the time his windows were open, but the smell was so bad he closed them. It disappeared for only a few moments and then reappeared again a third time right in front of his car. And as Beaufort says, at that moment it hit me that this object was after neither me nor my car, but after the light from my headlights. Then I stopped the car and turned off the lights. I looked up again, and this object spun wildly, turned, and flew back into space in a fraction of a second. At that moment, I felt my arms start to burn, and my only thought was to get out and let someone know what I had seen. I drove on to Livonia, and by this time my arm was really burning. I don't mind telling you, I was mighty frightened. It left me so shaken I could hardly continue driving. So it took him about 15 minutes to reach Livonia. He immediately spoke to a military major who advised him to proceed directly to Anderson Air Base in South Carolina, which he did. And he shared his account, and FAA officers, including Albert Myrick and Dean Carpenter, interviewed him and examined his car and actually used a civil defense Geiger counter to see if there was any radiation. And as Beaufort says, they recorded where the paint on the car had been damaged by the oily substance the flying object had left behind. They also examined my arms from the elbow down. I still had the burning sensation in them after I had washed them thoroughly. Now I was no longer the only one convinced that I had encountered something from another world, for my entire car was radioactive. Now, FAA officer Albert Myrick later disputed this claim, but he did confirm the strange spots on Beaufort's car, and he also described Beaufort as intelligent, sincere, and sober. Beaufort later said he had his car washed, but the oily stains remained, and in fact the car hood was somewhat warped and the paint bubbled up. This was also verified later by researchers, and as Beaufort says, even today the stains are there for everyone to see. Before my experience with this flying top, I had always been quite skeptical of the reports of unidentified flying objects, but now I am completely convinced that they exist. Also, 1 month after this encounter, Beaufort said his radiators had all kinds of problems. Now, he did give interviews to reporters about his experience, and this is when the Air Force released a statement saying that Beaufort had probably seen the phenomena known as, quote, ball lightning, and that the odor he detected was ozone, and that the damage to his car was caused by heat from the lightning. Now, never mind that Beaufort had described a structured craft. This was their explanation. Beaufort, of course, heard about it and vehemently disagreed and said, quote, there was not a cloud in the sky. Lightning would not rotate at the top and bottom as this object did. Was definitely not that because ball lightning could not have followed my car at least 2 miles. I saw it with my own eyes. Now, researchers soon learned that there were apparently other witnesses, and in fact some claimed to have been burned as well. About 25 miles northwest of Livonia in Turnerville, Georgia, a group of people saw what was apparently the same craft on the same night, and one of the witnesses reportedly also was burned and said that a bag of groceries in her car also showed exposure to heat. I couldn't find any real confirmation other than one sentence, so I don't know about that. But the next night, on June 30th, a Mr. D.E. Welford said he was driving along Highway US 29 near the South Carolina border, not far from all this, when he saw the same kind of object. He said it was a spinning, top-shaped object about the size of a car. It swooped down right over his vehicle and also gave off an offensive odor. And he said also that his car showed signs of radioactivity. And things weren't over yet. 1 week later, July 7, near Tallulah Falls, Georgia, Jimmy Ivester was visiting his parents. They were in the living room when interference on the TV got so bad that they just turned it off and went outside. Now, there were quite a few people there. Not only Jimmy Ivester and his wife, but his parents, Henry Ivester and his wife, 3 sisters, Judy, Janie, and Joanne, and their neighbor. So quite a group of people here. And stepping outside, they immediately saw an object moving at treetop level about 300 feet away. They said it was fiery red, bowl-shaped. It had a row of 3 lights on the bottom, totally silent, not far. It came down and hovered a mere 3 feet above their neighbor's house, Russell Hickman's house. It rose up, emitted a green light, and left behind, they said, a terrible odor, which they described as, quote, something like embalming or brake fluid. And as Jimmy says, we thought it was a plane about to crash, but it wasn't. Now it turns out Diane Hickman was in the house near where this object was hovering, and she also saw it. And in fact, the next morning when she woke up, her face was red and her eyes were swollen. Now her mother was also in the house. She didn't see the object, but she says she felt this stinging and burning sensation on her arms and face. As you can imagine, the police were called. Hebersham County Sheriff A.J. Chapman arrived on the scene, and although he didn't see the object, he did smell the terrible odor, and as he called it, quote, the most peculiar odor I've ever smelled. Another witness was the neighbor, Mrs. Fred Rodacker. She saw this object coming down and could see that it was, quote, not a plane. I just don't know what it was. I believe there was a man in that thing. She tried to convince her husband Fred to come out, but he said, you're just seeing things. So he missed out. Events were not over yet. 1 week later, on July 14, the UFO returned. And this time the witness was a reporter, Tom Winfield of the Atlanta Constitution. In fact, he was called to the scene, a Gainesville motel, by an employee of the hotel, Whit Embry, who said this UFO was hovering in the sky. Tom arrived at 11 p.m., and sure enough, this object came swooping down. Tom described this object as bowl-shaped. He watched it stop, hover, and then shoot straight up into the sky. And that same night, another witness, Patty Upton, a little girl, was bicycling with her friend in Tallulah Falls and tearfully told her parents, running into the house, that she and her friend had just had an encounter with a low-flying object that she said was stunk real bad. So this is an amazing series of events. Beaufort, his sighting is really the most amazing of all of them. Sadly, Beaufort Parham passed away on January 13, 1966 at age 49, only 1 year and 6 months after his encounter with the UFO. I do think we have to consider the possibility that this is another case of a reverse-engineered craft. But if so, what the heck is it doing harassing this witness the way it did for miles and miles? I mean, it is crazy. But given that it did leave some residue on his car, I wish we had gotten the results of that. It's funny how these Air Force studies, they just kind of fizzle up and dry out, and we never hear anything about it after that. But apparently, yeah, it did involve radioactivity. Certainly a compelling case. Now let's move to the next one. I love finding these cases that are outside of the United States, and this is one of them. I call this one the UFO force field. This occurred on December 31st, 1972 in Pulkkinen, Finland. This does involve 2 witnesses, and this I think would probably be categorized as a close encounter of the second kind, because it did affect the environment, particularly the witnesses, and in fact it affected them in a very unusual way, as we shall see. This short but very unusual case was published in the Quarterly Report of the UFO Researchers of Finland. It involves 2 young women, Rita Kalho, age 21, and her friend Sirka Pulkkinen, age 22. They had just enjoyed a dance to celebrate the upcoming New Year, again December 31st, 1972, and they were taking a walk outside the village of Pulkkinen in Finland. They had only just left when Rita noticed a bright red sphere, bigger than the moon, she said, flashing in the sky. And just moments later, both Rita and Circa saw this small red orb, about the size of a tennis ball, moving nearby at only about 6 feet off the ground. And it moved quickly forward, appearing and disappearing. In fact, when a car drove by, this light quickly took off. The ladies continued to walk hand in hand when suddenly, out of nowhere, Rita was struck by some kind of force field, very powerful, and it actually threw her about 9 feet down to the ground, knocking the breath right out of her. In fact, it took her a few seconds to free herself from whatever force had thrown her to the ground, and looking around, this is when she saw a black object about 6 feet wide floating 3 feet off the ground right in front of them. It had a bright white light on the top of it. Rita jumped up and ran screaming for the nearest house. Now at that same exact moment, Circa saw this red orb again, and it came zooming up towards her, and in fact went right below her right shoulder. She could feel heat and energy radiating from it, and she also got caught in this strange force field, which she said enveloped the environment around her with complete silence and made moving very difficult. In fact, it took her several moments to free herself from this force field, apparently exerted by this orb, but she did free herself, and she ran directly towards the same house that Rita had fled to. Now both safe in the house, both ladies were covered with mud. Rita was missing one of her shoes, and it turned out her feet were black and blue with bruises. So strange. I keep running into cases where UFOs do have this kind of force field with them, as happened with the witness Charles Engelbrecht in Dale, Indiana. Same here with these two ladies in Finland. There's some sort of perhaps powerful magnetic field around these craft that can have these kinds of effects, but certainly unusual. Now let's move to the next case. And I wanted to include this one just because I think it's unique as far as I know. I don't know of any other single case quite like this. And I call this one UFO Goes Postal. I only found one source for this case, so take it for what it's worth. It does appear to be an absolute legitimate report. The witness is very credible. It occurred on October 2nd, 1976 in Palestine, Texas. And yeah, wait till you hear this one. I bet you've never heard anything quite like this one before. The sole source for this case comes from the Herald Press in Palestine, Texas. The witness is Albert Young. He was in his 80s at the time of his encounter. He's a former military officer. He was in his home when he heard this weird, quote, squeaking sound. Again, this is October 2nd, 1976. And hearing the squeaking sound, it sounded to him like it was coming from the house of his neighbor, Ray Bullard, 300 yards away. In fact, he first assumed that a car must have struck Ray Bullard's mailbox. But that's not what he saw when he looked in that direction. Looking outside, he saw a single blue light surrounded by yellow lights rising up over the trees. It appeared to be less than a foot in diameter. It immediately began to move towards him, then went directly over Ray Bullard's mailbox, rose upwards, turned sharply, and vanished behind Albert's house. And as Albert says, it was a UFO. It was in my view no more than 10 or 15 seconds. It made no sound after it left Ray Bullard's mailbox until it went out of my sight behind the trees back of my house. So that alone was strange enough. But the real twist came the next morning when Ray Bullard's mailbox turned up missing. They found it later. It was uprooted a half-mile east of Crockett Road. This is a considerable distance away. The mailbox was deeply dented on its front side, apparently, believes Albert, by the UFO. Now the Bullards said that they neither heard nor saw anything unusual. The pole holding the mailbox was undamaged. Albert was very reluctant to report what he saw, but after talking with his neighbors and seeing this mailbox missing, he decided to come forward, and he talked to a reporter from the Herald Press. And regarding the subject of UFOs, says Albert, I've heard about those things, but I never saw or heard one before. I suppose it's possible that one was ball lightning, but how would it carry a mailbox that far away from its original location? I'm thinking it's this magnetic field or something again that lifted this mailbox up and carried it for quite some distance. I don't know. Really hard to say for sure without a more thorough interview with the witness, but certainly worthy of being well known, I think, because it's another example of these strange effects UFOs can have. Now let's move to the next case. This one is actually pretty special for me personally because I've investigated quite a few cases of UFOs at drive-in theaters. In fact, I wrote a whole book about it. I found over 100 cases. This case I found afterwards, so it's not in the book. That's one of the reasons I really wanted to include it. You never close an investigation. The more I look into UFOs at drive-in theaters, the more cases I find. And this is a really dramatic example of one, which occurred in June 1983 in Mobile, Alabama. And I call this one, People Were Screaming. It was one evening in late June 1983 that some 300 to 400 people were gathered together to watch a drive-in movie at an unnamed theater in Mobile, Alabama. Now, according to at least two of the people there, independent witnesses who do not know each other, at some point during this movie, UFOs showed up. One of the witnesses was Larry B. Casherman, a 28-year-old off-duty fireman. He was at the theater with his wife and 3 children when he noticed what looked to him like 2 unusual craft swooping and hovering at very low elevation directly over the theater. The only sound he could hear coming from them was a low hum, but per Larry, they were huge, luminous spheres with colored lights shining from what looked like portholes or windows going around the circumference of the craft. Now, strangely, Larry at first didn't even remember this sighting, nor did his family. They drove home with no memory of it, but he did eventually remember. As Larry says, "I didn't remember at first, but I had these crazy dreams for a while about spaceships. Then it started to come back to me. My wife and the kids don't remember a thing. It's like they were never there. There had to be 300 to 400 people there screaming and trying to get their cars out of the exits. They just took off. Speakers were laying all over the ground." Now again, Larry is not the only witness. Per a newspaper article by Lewis Clifton titled "Shining UFOs Panic Drive-In Movie," there was another witness. Her name is Sandra Paget, age 17, and she remembers seeing these objects. As Sandra says, "We didn't know it was real flying saucers at first. We thought it was just something they were doing for a promotional stunt, you know. Then people started screaming, and all the cars started up and everything. My boyfriend and I were really scared." But this is where it gets even more interesting and weird. Like Larry Casherman's family, Sandra says that her boyfriend has no memory of this event. Says Sandra, "My boyfriend still doesn't believe me. Even when he admits he can't remember the end of the show, he says he just fell asleep or something. But I remember. I know what happened. I was there, and I don't ever want to go through that again." Well, unfortunately, no other witnesses have stepped forward, and whatever happened that night at the drive-in theater remains a mystery. How amazing is that? Another case at a drive-in theater. I keep getting new ones. There is definitely something going on with this. What's really interesting to me about that particular case is that some of these witnesses have amnesia of the event. It's not that unusual. I've got a number of other drive-in theater cases with that same thing. Don't think this necessarily indicates that there was an onboard experience or anything like that, because even a simple sighting, people will have memory problems with it. Not quite sure what's going on there. I don't know. It's just a really odd case. And that's why I wanted to include it, because it adds to that catalog of drive-in theater cases. There's so many of them. All right, now let's move to the next one. This one, I'm not sure how you would categorize this other than a UFO crash retrieval, but I call this one the alien skeletons. This occurred sometime in March of 1987 in an unidentified location in western Kentucky. The witness insisted on absolute anonymity and definitely did not want the exact location named either. And I think once you hear this account, You'll understand why. And it only came to be revealed by pure synchronicity, by pure lucky coincidence, which makes me wonder how many other cases like this there are out there. This is a very unusual case of an apparent UFO crash retrieval, which again was publicized by Leonard Stringfield and comes from a retired medical doctor who had an amazing story to tell. It was first publicly revealed by researcher Bilbo Shears in his radio show, and then published in part in the MUFON Journal issue number 249, and in Timothy Good's book The UFO Report, and the Kentucky MUFON newsletter, and in Leonard Stringfield's status reports. It's so strange, this case definitely deserves to be well known. Now, the witness is a doctor whose name is known by Leonard Stringfield and Bilbo Shears, and he told them that in 1987 he was taking a stroll on his 400-acre farm property. He does not want the location known. All we know is it's in western Kentucky, March 1987. So he's walking on his farm when he comes upon a mysterious burned circle. He said it was about 4 feet in diameter in an open grassy field. So that's strange enough. But right next to this circle, he found 2 humanoid skeletons, each lying about 4 feet apart from each other. There was no evidence of any clothing. Predators had already caused some damage, he could see. Again, he's a medical doctor. He can see some residual tissues, such as ligaments. And as a medical doctor, he was certain that these skeletons were not any known animal. And in fact, on closer examination, he could see that they were definitely bipedal, about 4 feet tall. They had large skulls, a jaw much like a cat, a barrel-like rib cage, and very long arms. And he also noticed another very interesting detail. Each hand had only 3 fingers. Judging by the rate of decomposition, he estimated that these skeletons had been there for some time, likely about 100 days, but not much longer than that. Now, alarmed by this discovery, as you can imagine, he immediately called the sheriff, who immediately contacted the Air Force. And to the doctor's surprise, they were there the very next morning. 3 Air Force helicopters arrived and landed on his property. A large group of people, some in uniform, some not, were deployed over a very large area, exploring his entire farm. One of the men approached the doctor. He's an Air Force colonel, and he was very kind, stated clearly and cordially that it was his mission to remove the skeletons and the soil beneath them, as well as remove the soil where this burned circle was, and to search the surrounding terrain for any evidence related to this discovery. So by the end of the day, all the evidence had been removed, and in fact fresh soil was placed over the excavated area, and the doctor was informed that the burned circle in fact showed evidence of having been exposed to a heat source of some 3,000 degrees. The doctor himself was escorted to a nearby military base for further questioning, and he says that the military officers showed him photographs of other alien bodies that they had recovered. And he says that they then, quote, put the fear of God into me and warned him to never talk about it. But thankfully he did. It sounds like that witness was threatened pretty badly by these government folks. It's really interesting that he says that they actually showed him photographs of other ET bodies. That does turn up in other cases. And I like the case because this is a medical doctor. He knows what he's looking at. Such a shame that he called the police right away and turned this over to the Air Force. If this had gone public, it could have really helped to bring this subject much more to the forefront. But I'm glad that this witness was friends with Bilbo Shears, who I met, by the way. He's a fantastic guy. It turns out he was a witness in the Topanga Canyon UFO wave, which I researched, and he saw something in Topanga Canyon on that one night, June 14, 1992. He's a terrific guy. I absolutely think he's sincere. So if he says he met this doctor, I believe him. And Leonard Stringfield, as well, is a very well-respected researcher. And God bless him for bringing these kinds of cases to light and having people take them more seriously, certainly, than they were for years and years and years. Nobody would even look at UFO crash cases for a very long time. So yeah, Leonard Stringfield has done a huge service for this field. Now let's move to the next case. I think of all the cases in this collection today, this one is my favorite. There's just something really poignant about it. Just something real sincere. This one I call We Were Being Watched. This occurred on November 19, 1989 in Arkansas, again an undisclosed location. The witness, again, wants to remain anonymous, but there are 5 witnesses to this case. One is a police officer. There's no possibility of misidentification or misperception in this case because they came upon a landed UFO and watched it for quite some time. It's an extraordinary case and incredibly detailed. This case comes from longtime UFO researcher Sam Updegrove. It is a very close and profound encounter involving 4 teenagers and a gentleman by the name of Dale, a deputy sheriff. It was after midnight, November 19, 1989, again somewhere in Arkansas. It was a slow night for Officer Dale, so he decided to check out the back roads and make sure that there were no local teenagers out there drinking beer or misbehaving in some way. So he was driving around for a while, and about 1:35 a.m., came around a corner on a remote gravel road and nearly collided into an old Chevy pickup parked in the middle of this road. All 4 doors were open, and he immediately saw 4 teenagers, 2 boys and 2 girls, standing alongside it. And it was odd, because even though he stopped only 15 feet from them, none of the kids turned around to look at him. Instead, they were staring intently at something down the road in front of them. So Dale looked, and he could see a dark, bulky shape of some kind in the dim light. So he turned on his police spotlight and shone it on the object, and he could hardly believe what he saw. I'll just let Dale describe it in his own words. As he says, it was dark gray and dull looking, sort of like galvanized tin or something on that order. The shape was, well, I hate to say it, but it was just exactly like you would expect a flying saucer to look. 2 saucers, really, with one of them turned upside down on top of the other. I remember noticing that I couldn't see any joint where the edge was, which really struck me as being odd, because it looked like 2 halves joined together, but it was just smooth, with no line. What really got to me, though, wasn't the looks of the thing. It was what it was doing. It just sat there in the air, not touching anything. It was absolutely motionless, except for a sort of wobbling motion, and not much of that. The bottom of it couldn't have been more than 3 or maybe 4 feet above the road, if that much. So this object was large, about 30 feet across, smooth, there was no dome, no markings, no windows, and Dale's spotlight was on this object for about 3 seconds, when suddenly the spotlight went out. In fact, so did the entire electrical system of his cruiser, the headlights, the radio, engine, all of it cut off. And as Dale says, I'm not ashamed to tell you, I was a bit scared. Then I heard one of the girls who was standing up by the other car sort of sobbing, and she said, "Oh my God, it got him too." That didn't help matters any. So Officer Dale learned from the kids that they had just arrived a few moments before. They had shown their high beams on this object, and immediately their truck engine and the entire electrical system also died. They got out of the truck and were standing there wondering what to do, and this is when Officer Dale arrived. Now he noticed that the entire environment around them was blanketed in complete silence. No noises whatsoever, no insects, nothing. So he moved forward to stand next to the teenagers, and he could now see a soft bluish glow coming from beneath the object. The 5 witnesses whispered softly back and forth, asking each other what this object could possibly be. As Dale says, we just stood there like we were waiting for something to happen, but we didn't know what. I tell you, a lot of weird things went through my mind. I was scared, but not because it had really done anything to be threatening. I thought that maybe when the cars shined bright lights on it, while it was just minding its own business, whatever that was, maybe whoever or whatever was in that might have felt like they were the ones being threatened. After a while, I was almost wishing something would happen. The waiting was starting to get to me. And then finally something did happen. The blue glow below the craft started to increase, while at the same time the craft rose silently and vertically straight up. It rose about 20 feet upwards. The witnesses could now see that there was a thick ring of blue light about 1 foot wide on the bottom of the craft. The craft continued to rise up to about 100 feet high, just above the surrounding treetops. It hovered there for a few moments and then darted away at, quote, impossible speed. As Dale says, 1 second it was just sitting there, and the next, all you could see of it was a bluish-green streak across the sky towards the northwest. Now at that exact moment, loud rock music instantly began blaring from the car radio inside of the Chevy pickup. All the lights came on at once. All 5 of the witnesses jumped up in shock. If this was an encounter that convinced them all, as you can imagine, of the reality of UFOs. And as Dale says, I was always one who took all these flying saucer stories with a big grain of salt. But I know what I saw, and others were there who witnessed the same thing. What I saw was as real and solid as an airplane, and I looked at it in the spotlight from no more than 100 feet away at the most. How interesting is that? I mean, that's a scene straight out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be that close to a craft, but it's got all these really interesting effects we hear so much about. The Oz effect, this eerie silence that settles over the environment when a UFO is near, as well as electromagnetic disturbances. And when you have 2 cars that are shut down by the close presence of a UFO, that's not a coincidence. There's clearly some sort of field surrounding these craft that is affecting automobile engines and lights. It's pretty funny, that one detail where after the UFO leaves and the rock station starts playing at full blast, making them all jump a foot in the air. It's almost as scary as the UFO sighting itself, but certainly a fascinating case. And now let's move to the final case. This is another one that really surprised me because I did a whole bunch of research on cases that are called car lift cases. These are cases in which automobiles are lifted up into the air, presumably by a UFO. Now, a UFO was not seen by the witness in this case, though someone else in the area did see a UFO in this area at this time. So probably that was the effect. But yeah, this gentleman claims that his car was lifted up. I call this one the floating car. It occurred on February 26, 1996 in Gutierrez, Spain. And this is one of many, many cases involving car lifts. I included a whole chapter in my book, Not From Here, about car lift cases because they're not unique. But this one does have some really interesting details to it. This case comes from researcher Manuel Carballal. The witness is Andre Landera. On the evening of February 26, 1996, he had gone out to play some pool and drink coffee at the Ramiro bar in Gutierrez, Spain. Then he got in his Renault 18 and began the drive to his home in Gutierrez. This is in Lugo, Spain. It was about 2:10 a.m., and he was attempting to ascend a hill and go over a bridge near the small village of Friba. And this is when he noticed that his car appeared to be malfunctioning. It seemed not to have enough power to make it up the hill. So Andre changed to a lower gear, reduced his speed, but then the car would not move forward at all. And then, without any warning, he felt an immense acceleration, and he could no longer see the bridge that had been ahead of him moments before. Now confused and afraid, he turned off the car engine, and this is when he heard a strange sound, which he says was, quote, like a strong wind blowing. He also noticed that the hood of his car was lifting up, and the entire vehicle was, quote, oscillating. It was shaking back and forth. It felt to Andre almost as if his car was floating. So he opened the window, looked down at the road, and his confusion turned to fear. He was incredibly shocked because his car, he saw, was in fact floating a full 30 feet above the ground. As Andre says, I held onto the steering wheel with all my might. He would later tell UFO investigator Manuel Carballal, I forced myself back into the driver's seat, and I thought I was going to die, being taken to God knows where. Hell, I was really scared. But after several moments, his car was placed gently back on the ground, and whatever force had lifted his car released it. Now, back on the ground, his car was slightly ahead of its original position. It was now sideways on the road. He could now hear a very loud humming noise, which he says was comparable to a hairdryer. And he was able to determine the exact moment of this encounter because his dashboard clock froze at that moment. So it read 2:10 a.m. Later, an employee at the nearby telephone exchange said that he had observed strange lights in the sky at that location at that time. So this is independent confirmation. The local Civil Guard detachment was notified of Andre's encounter, and apparently they were not able to explain this incident. But more interesting information was uncovered when it was discovered that there were power outages and brownouts near that area. And both before and after this incident, there were a number of other sightings in this area. So this appears to be a fully legitimate case despite its unusual nature. In fact, Andre's friend, Pablo, who is the owner of Ramiro's bar, confirmed that Andre had not consumed alcohol that evening and that he was an honest man. He told researcher Manuel Carballal, "If Andre says that his car flew through the air, then it flew through the air." How about that? It does not appear that this gentleman was taken on board or anything like that. Certainly he does not report that. Doesn't mean he wasn't, because as we know, this can slip by a person. They can have missing time and not even know it. But certainly a fascinating case. And it's super interesting because there is outside corroboration. There are character references supporting the credibility of this witness. And the fact that so many other people report having their cars lifted up into the air. How scary is that? Looking down and seeing you're 30 feet up off the ground. Amazing. So there you go. That's 12 cases coming from all over the world, 1946 to 1996, all different kinds of cases, first, second, third kind. This just goes to show how varied the UFO experience can be. For some people, it's a simple sighting. For others, it's an onboard experience, even coming upon a crashed UFO or alien body. I mean, just about anything can happen on this planet, apparently. And I think all of these cases show once again what we already know by now. We are not alone. We are being visited. The Earth is not the only planet in this universe that is populated. It's a busy, populated universe out there. That's exactly what this evidence is showing us. I think it's the simplest explanation that extraterrestrials are out there. So yeah, really, really interesting and always something new to learn on this subject. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you found this episode interesting. I truly appreciate all your guys' support. It means a lot to me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. If you're not having fun, probably doing something wrong. Do something else. Do something that brings you joy. That's it for now. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.